Visiting enemy ground, all right, and jumping in at the last minute. She's a clinical health psychologist and the assistant professor of psychiatry at the UT Health Science Center in San Antonio. Is that correct? She's been a TEDx speaker, and she'll get your blood going this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, so how's that documentary that we saw earlier? Great, right? Awesome. And that hasn't been that long ago since we've not known what PTSD is. So I work for an organization called Strong Star, which is Strong Star PTSD Research Consortium. So I mostly work with combat-related veterans experiencing combat-related PTSD. And you know, it's only been the past couple of decades maybe that we've understood what PTSD is. There's still a lot of stigma around PTSD and around mental health difficulties in general, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. So half of what I do is my faculty role as a professor at UT Health, so it has been rebranded from Health Science Center to just UT Health San Antonio. And the other half of what I do is developing programs and serving to bridge the gap between the complex but very important research world and the general public. So communicating what are mental health struggles, how does the brain work, and how do we understand what to do with that so that we can live healthy, functioning lives. So when we think about breaking stigma, I think about this in two main paths. So the first one is developing a greater understanding about an issue. If we just understand what's going on, then a lot of the myths and assumptions that we make fall away. The second one here is creating new norms. This relates to our culture. So when we look at how to do this, the first one is research. So getting solid research on certain issues and understanding why it happens, how to flag it, and what to do with it. And then the second piece is our culture. How do we make cultural shifts around the way that we talk about mental health and how we have that as an open conversation even before things get to full disorder? As a clinical health psychologist, after I finished all my training and I was working in the field, I started to question, why am I getting people at the end point of disease and disorder? I'm treating people after a full mental health disorder has developed and they're having problems in their relationships and issues with functioning in their career. And as a health psychologist, I was working with people after they had a cardiovascular event, so a heart attack. And we were plugging in stress management courses after that because we know when we do that, the potential of having a second cardiac event significantly drops. But why are we waiting for the first one? So I started to think about this. You know, these things don't happen automatically. Just kind of one day you're fine, the next day you have a disorder. Or one day you're fine, the next day you have a heart attack. It might feel that way sometimes, but there's things that are happening in terms of inside the body for heart attacks and inside the brain for mental health disorders. That if we build awareness into that, and I think this is kind of the forefront of where everything is going, understanding mental health and understanding these lifestyle shifts that we need to make to prevent greater problems in the long term. So when we go back to the research side of things, breaking down that first step. So I mentioned that I work for Strong Star. Strong Star is a research organization. It's also affiliated with CAP, which is the Consortium to Alleviate PTSD. We're funded by the Department of Defense and the VA, and we've got multiple large ongoing research trials that we look at combat-related PTSD, and really PTSD in our veterans and active duty service members who have served in combat. So our main location is in San Antonio, but we've got sites in multiple places, including Fort Hood. That's one of our other main locations. And we've got a lot of these ongoing studies. So what we're looking at is looking at PTSD in the military, of course, and prolonged exposure and cognitive processing therapy. So those are the two main approaches that we use. But we also look at written exposure therapy, written expression therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, nightmare prescription training, couples-based approaches, also family-based approaches to make sure that families stay strong through the deployment cycle. So we've got a lot of different pieces going on here. What we're noticing is that the treatments that have been shown to work well in civilian populations for PTSD are working in combat populations, but not as well. So we're trying to figure out how to augment these treatments to make them work better for more people. So some of the trials that we have going on right now is an intensive outpatient model where people can fly in to San Antonio, and I think they have this going on in Fort Hood as well, and get intensive treatment. So instead of taking 1 session a week for 12 weeks, we do 2 weeks of treatment where they're coming in every day. This is really good because they can get this in kind of a quick package instead of letting this drag out where people drop off and different life events happen. And so we're asking more questions too. So the next forefront is genetics. Is there a genetic predisposition that might put somebody more at risk for the development of PTSD after the exposure of a trauma? We're looking at how does the brain change when PTSD starts to develop, and even after treatment, how is the brain different? We know that all of this is coming back to the brain. As a psychologist, I can't take somebody's blood and tell them exactly what's going on for them. I measure thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. And that's what I look at to categorize what the problem is, what disorder they might be having, and then applying a treatment to that. So we know that those come from how the brain is functioning, the brain and the nervous system together. So with our studies, what we're showing is around 40% of our veterans and active duty military members are treated to remissions. This means when we take them into our studies, they have post-traumatic stress disorder. When they go through about 10 to 12 sessions of treatment, they don't anymore, about 40%. We want that number to be higher. That's why this research is really important, to augment these approaches in different ways to see how we can make them work better. We also know that these outcomes are maintained for over 6 months. So this means people who are getting better are staying better. That's very important. And we used to think that if we pushed the trauma too much, if we asked directly about it, it would be too activating for people and they might become suicidal. We're finding in our research, of course, now that these trauma-focused treatments have been developed, we know that's not the case. We need to ask exactly what happened and get them to talk about it to get better with it. And we're noticing that whenever we treat it, there is no increase in suicidality, which is great. Now, our questions remain about the genetic pieces and really getting at kind of the biology and the brain and behind what PTSD is. So what we kind of think about at Strong Star, we have a lot of artwork from some of the veterans and service members that we've worked with, which is really great. But we're trying to solve the puzzle of PTSD one study at a time. So we've been lucky enough to get really good funding, having multiple trials going on, and working with top researchers across the country, and there's more information out there. We're taking referrals all the time. Most of our studies are San Antonio-based or Fort Hood-based, but since we have our intensive outpatient, people are flying in from all over the country to do these 2 weeks of treatment, so just keep that in mind. Now, the second piece of breaking stigma, so we had research, we also have the culture piece. And what blows my mind is that, we have a knee, we have a hip, we have an elbow, and we have a brain. But when we talk about mental health difficulties and struggles, we don't usually talk about it in the same way that if I bruise a tendon, I go to the doctor, not a big deal, I'm a little bit annoyed by it, right? And I apply the proper treatment and tell my friends, tell my coworkers. I'm not embarrassed about that. It's my body that's messing up. When it comes to the brain, mental health difficulties have been a little bit different. There's more stigma attached to that. But what confuses me is, we have these other body parts and we have this brain, this master organ that's conducting how we feel on a daily basis. And a lot of that is completely outside of our control. Our nervous system functions underneath our control for a large part. Our heart rate keeps going, we keep breathing even when we're not thinking about it. And so sometimes our brain throws forward different thoughts, emotions, and behaviors that immediately are outside of our control. And if we gain insight into that, we can kind of augment and calibrate around it. So when I talk about PTSD, I essentially say, the brain is hijacked. These kind of responses, that startle response that you get when the door slams, or when you feel very on edge when you're in a crowd and you can't just have fun at Six Flags, that's not your fault. It's not mind over matter here. And we hear a lot of these phrases or colloquialisms in our culture of mind over matter. Just think positive. I hate that one. Does that ever work? Maybe for a second, right? We can shift our mindset and have a little bit of a different feeling. But over time, if we're not going to get the root issue, then we start to feel bad again. And then we just feel guilty for not being able to snap into a better mindset to change our life or get rid of our difficulties. So with PTSD, the nervous system is hijacked. We have our animal brain kind of deeper inside of our brain. This is our limbic system, our amygdala. This responds with fear and threat to different stimuli and happens very much outside of our control. And when that system is engaged, our sympathetic nervous system is on kind of arousal there, that our heart rate goes up, our breathing changes, our blood pressure changes, how our digestive system functions, that shifts, and we feel that very strongly. Now, what controls some of those responses, and why we get better at controlling emotions from when we're 2 years old to 32 years old, is because our frontal lobe develops a little bit more. The frontal lobe is responsible for cooling things down and saying, hey, emotion brain, animal brain, that response isn't going to make sense anymore. I know you want to punch your coworker, but that's not a good idea right now. So we're gonna chill that down. We're not gonna let you act on that urge. Now what we're seeing in PTSD research and mental health research in general, especially with anxiety disorders and stress-related disorders, is that when those anxiety responses are becoming a problem, that amygdala, that limbic system, the animal brain is using more energy, has more kind of activity going on than somebody without some of those problems. So again, this is something that's happening in the brain. And after treatment, we're showing that the frontal lobe, this area, the prefrontal cortex, actually gains strength. So neurons begin to make connections that gives it a better ability to down-regulate the emotion brain. This helps people better regulate their thoughts, emotions, attention, and even behavior. And this is why people are getting better. We need more research into this. So to demonstrate this very quickly, we all have heard of optical illusions, we've all seen many of them. So let's take a look at this one. So would you say that those two squares are different colors?
What squares?
Oh, yeah. What squares is that?
Same color.
Right, okay, okay, you're saying same color. All right, you know the trick. They look different color, right? The bottom one looks lighter than the top one. Now this is a trick, because that highlight, where's my pointer here? This highlight right here is tricking the optical portion of our brain to perceive different colors. Now if I add a box on there, oops. Now just watch that bottom square, because when I go back and forth, that color does not change, right?
Correct.
But when we have this shown, the highlight shown, our brain perceives that change. Even when we know that those two squares are the same color, we cannot override that deeply wired perception process. Same thing with this one. Move your eyes across the screen. It looks like 3 cylinders are rolling, right? They're actually not. Of course we know. Again, it's because the different highlights around these squares, the white portion, are put in such a way that it's tricking the way that we perceive it, and then our brain perceives movement. Again, even when we know it's not moving, we can't turn that off, and we never will be able to. Same thing with this one. This is one of my favorites. A lot of movement happening, right? And yet, it's not there. And if we focus on one point in that and let everything become still, it stops moving for the most part. But when we look around, there's a lot of movement. This process of perception is kind of part of our, deeper brain that we've carried over time. We need this to perceive our world. Our mind fills in a lot of gaps about what we're seeing. That's good, because it helps us kind of move forward and navigate our environment. Sometimes though, when certain issues pop up, we might be filling in assumptions, filling in people's motives, predicting the future, and filling in those gaps in ways that might not be helpful or make sense for us. Here's another one, kind of Willy Wonka style. A lot of movement in that one. Okay, now this. Can anybody tell what this is?
Lobster.
Okay, we've got a lobster. Somebody said fish.
No, face.
A face. A soldier, army.
Oh, I see it now.
Okay. This picture is just abstract enough to where our brain can't pull together the pieces. But once I show you what it actually is, you will never be able to unsee it. Huh? Going back to the other one. You see it now, right?
Yes.
That won't go away. And just in this moment, our brain got enough information to plug together some pieces which caused some neurons to change in our brain ever so slightly things got put together, and now different circuitry is firing, and we can't unsee the frog. So, how does this relate to mental health? It relates to the brain. We can't deny that our own brains change the way that we see the world in ways that we might not even realize. And when I work with veterans or really civilians, anyone with PTSD, anxiety, depression, OCD, you name it, I see this process happening where the brain is playing tricks. The amygdala, the limbic system, the animal brain is throwing forth these responses or giving certain feelings that feel very true, but they might not be accurate. And a lot of those blanks are being filled in. Now, once that awareness is brought to these issues and people can start to see why it might not be as helpful or realistic, then those neurons, things start to connect and they can see, they can then observe the urge to run away or avoid something, but not act on that because they know it's not as real as it feels like it is. Just like we can see that movement and know that it's not actually real. Now the problem here is if we don't understand things like that and understand that these responses really come from our circuitry and the way that our brain is set up, because we have a brain, an elbow, hip, and knee, then what we add on top of the struggle that we're already experiencing is judgment for the struggle, which makes that struggle even heavier. So when we move forth and we look at our own lives, and I think transparency is really important. Life is tough. It's not like you have a disorder or you're completely fine. There's a big spectrum of symptoms that stack up to lead to a disorder. And in those symptoms that stack up, there's still just stress. And life is inherently stressful. So we all fall in a spectrum of something. And especially with stressful events, combat trauma, those stack up even more. But I think to acknowledge that we are all human beings with certain struggles because of the brain that we have and how it interacts with the environment that we're given, that's something that happens naturally to some extent, and we can have more as a conversation. So the big question is, how do we break this stigma? How do we start to talk about this in a way that helps people be more comfortable saying, hey, I got a cold last week and this week I'm feeling a little bit depressed. It's part of the process of being alive. I think this breaks down in 3 ways, and this is something actionable that we can all, no matter your position, how you work with veterans, who you are, you can take with you and put into action in terms of what roles you have. Number 1 is speaking about it. Speak in biological terms, just like I broke it down with the brain, right? We have a brain, therefore we are set up to struggle in ways that might not be as accurate as it feels like they are. Speak up when you hear stigma, when you hear somebody say, oh, just think positive, or oh, you're fine, or mind over matter. Maybe provide a little bit of information to say, well, sometimes struggles do happen because of the way the brain is functioning. And we don't have to skip away from that. In fact, change happens when we're able to sit with it, understand why it's happening, and then build tools around it. And then providing a roadmap for treatment. A lot of the talking that I do is about how to even find mental health care, how to select a mental health provider, and what proper treatment looks like. What does the research say that works? Number 2, so we have speaking number 1. Number 2 is staying aware, knowing what the current research says, what's coming out in programs that are aligning with that. And just like Amy was talking about, finding local resources so that you know what exists here and something that you can connect somebody to, and even online. So, now that we're in the era of telehealth, within the state of Texas, it's possible to see a provider if you're living here from any corner of Texas. And I think that we're going to see policy and different guidelines changing around that in the next 20 years. And then the third one here is model. Model appropriate self-care, a balanced life. If we look at this cultural shift that we need to support, it's making sure that we work well and work hard, but also have other things plugged in so that we can be balanced. I think another modeling that's important is seeking mental health treatment. Even before something gets so bad to where dysfunction and it's affecting your life to where it gets to that point. Seeing how you can examine who you are and what you bring to the table and kind of working with that to prevent health outcomes or mental health issues in the long term. And I think that's something we also need to be talking about is plugging in factors for resiliency. I know there's a lot of research being with that there. And then having the message of empowerment over shame. You having PTSD doesn't mean that you're broken and damaged forever. In fact, it means that we can gain awareness into how your brain is working and how it's tripping you up so that you can get skills to help yourself and help others for the long term. So once somebody has that information, the brain plugs it together, and that's change. You can't unsee the frog. Just like when we learn something new, we can't unlearn that. We now have the groundwork set, and the more that somebody's involved in mental health treatment and connected to resources, they're well on that way to improvement. Thank you.